Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode in my mystery series where today I'm going to be sharing the story of a John Doe case from here in the UK with possibly the worst Doe name I've ever heard, Fred the Head. It's genuinely terrible, but at least it's memorable, I suppose. This story will definitely stick in your brain. Here in the UK, we don't tend to get many unidentified people who remain unidentified. In fact, if you look on the list of unidentified murder victims in the UK on Wikipedia, there are only 19 people on that list, and I've already covered the majority of those. In fact, 6 of those people all hail from the same series of murders, which was the Thames Torso murders that date all the way back to the 1880s. I don't know for sure why we don't get many unidentified people here in the UK as opposed to countries like the USA and Canada, but if I had to take a guess, I think it's because we're a much smaller country with much less empty space. Our cities are closer together, in general people are tighter knit. And I don't mean that to say that everyone in the UK knows everyone else, like obviously that is not the case, but when everyone lives on a relatively small island with a population of almost 68 million, people do tend to be more interconnected. I mean, for me, a long drive is anything over 2 hours. That's a road trip. From where I live in the southeast of England, that'll get me like a third of the way up the country. Cities are closer, people are more interconnected, and whilst we do have a lot of green space in this country, if a body is dumped somewhere, chances are there's going to be someone out there who recognises them. Like I said, that's not the official reason. I couldn't find much about an official reason online, but if I had to take a guess, that would be why we don't have many unidentified people. Of course, there are more than the 19 that I mentioned on Wikipedia, but those are just the murder victims with enough detail to lend to a Wikipedia page. But still, it's not going to be much more than that. Fred the Head has been unidentified now for coming up to 52 years, and despite a fresh appeal made just a couple of years ago on the 50th anniversary of his discovery, no one has ever come forward with his name or his murderer. This unidentified man was discovered in a clandestine grave on March 27, 1971 by an off-duty special constable in the suburb of Wins Hill near Burton-upon-Trent in East Staffordshire. A lot of sources tend to refer to Wins Hill as a sleepy city because that sounds good for the media, doesn't it? But from what I can gather, it's actually just a suburb of Burton, with a mixture of affluent wealth, but also the much more humble areas. There are nice parts and not so nice parts, just like every area across the UK. But it does seem like today Wins Hill is a lot busier than it would have been 50 years ago, where sleepy might have been more of an apt description. David Nathan was the off-duty special constable to find this body. He was going out shooting for the evening when he crossed a small footbridge over the River Trent, which led to this small island in the river that was actually private property. Now, from my research, it doesn't even look like this bridge exists anymore, and this area is no longer accessible to the public, but it used to be about 100 yards from Newton Road. Nathan would say that he used to walk in this area on this private land all the time and he'd never seen anything before. But on that day he came across what looked like an old bag of cement. There was this hole where it looked like a dog or something had been digging in a certain spot, unearthing something strange at the bottom. And what he'd seen was enough for curiosity to take over, so Nathan rushes back to get a spade so he could have a dig himself. Turns out that what he'd seen was actually a skull protruding from the ground, hence the nickname locals would later give this unidentified man, Fred the Head. Soon Nathan would make the discovery that this was in fact a shallow grave with a whole body buried just 4 foot down. Nathan, not knowing what to do, would head back to work where he got his business partner out to confirm that his eyes weren't lying to him, and then they called the police. The police also obviously quickly confirmed this was a skull, and when they started digging, they had no idea whether it was actually going to be attached to a body or not. Turns out that it was, and they had to excavate this with the utmost care to ensure they didn't do any further damage. The body was found buried about 4 feet down, as I previously mentioned, and was in a strange position as if he'd sort of been sitting on his haunches, on his heels, with his hands and feet tied behind his back using polypropylene twine. Apparently this twine is often used in industry to secure very heavy things together, but being a horse girl myself, I see this as baling twine used to tie up hay bales, and it was later found the twine had been made in Bradford in West Yorkshire, which was about 2 hours north of Wins Hill. This wasn't much of a lead. The body was fairly intact, and whilst it had clearly started decomposing, a lot of the tissue did still remain in place, and his fingerprints, for the most part, were still there. It's been estimated that John Doe had been in his shallow grave anywhere from 9 to 18 months, so his death was fairly recent. The post-mortem took a little over 2 hours to complete, and the Doe network details John Doe, as I'm going to call him for the rest of this video because I hate the name Fred the Head, as a white male around 23 to 39 years old and about 5'8", although other sources do say 5'7". His hair was brown, straight and short, and he was too decomposed for them to ascertain an eye colour, but he did have one quite distinguishing feature. He had a deformed neck, a condition called torticollis, which would have caused his head to lean to the right, and his chin may have stuck out noticeably as well. Although I must admit, in the reconstruction photos we've seen, especially in the more recent ones, I don't think that's detailed very clearly. In the drawings from the 70s though, especially in the side profile, that looks to be a lot more clear to me. It's giving very Habsburg jaw. As well as this, John Doe had small hands with well-kept short nails, and he'd also had some interesting dental work going on. He'd had partial upper dentures that carried just the back teeth, and he'd had extensive dental work done on the bottom teeth less than 6 months before his death. He had multiple teeth with deep, deep fillings. These were teeth that probably should have been removed, but instead they were just filled. I find myself wondering if his teeth issues and protruding jaw might have been linked to his neck issues. I'll admit I'm no dentist myself and I know very little about teeth, but I saw some, I assume, experts online saying that his pattern of tooth decay was particularly intriguing as it didn't affect the occlusal surface at all, which I think occlusal means the parts of the teeth that touch, but it did affect all the lateral and buccal ones, which I think means the outside and inside of the teeth. Apparently that's very unusual. Now I know I do have some dental experts who pop up in my comments all the time, so if you guys have anything to know about that, then please do let me know. You would think because this dental work was so strange that it would be highly identifiable, but yet no dentist ever came forward claiming this work. His dentures were even put on display at a large dental exhibition in London that same year he was found, and it was visited by almost 10,000 people in the dental profession, and still nothing. The detective chief inspector at this time said there wasn't a single local dentist who hadn't seen the skull and the dentures, but back in the early 70s, dental work was a lot less regulated. That means this could have literally been done in the local pub for all they know, with no records required whatsoever. However, the denture does suggest he had a proper dentist at some point though. In the months after the discovery, an investigator actually went over to the USA to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington with John Doe's pelvis bones in tow, and experts there made a very specific age approximation of 29 years and 2 months. Now, I actually turned 29 years old in a couple of months, and it's always something very haunting when you talk about victims who are your own age. I think about my own life and it coming to an end now, and I realise how young I am, how much life I've still got to live. There's no denying that it would be cruelly cut short if I were to die now, and I'm sure that's how John Doe would have felt as well. 29 is so young. Around this same time as well, his skull was given to a forensic medical artist who used calipers to carefully measure the skull and form a composite sketch of this unidentified man. Over the decades, this drawing has been built on again and again, and up until as recently as 2021, when his face was colorised for the first time. And colour, I find, is always so important in reconstructions. It makes the victims seem more real, more lifelike. In recent years, there have been multiple versions of this composite sketch created, showing John Doe with all levels of facial hair and a number of hairstyles, glasses, no glasses, different styles of the time. It's very easy to create forensic sketches as per the styles of our current time, but you've got to bear in mind what the style was at this time in 1971, so they've drawn him as per this. John Doe was found completely naked, bar a pair of socks. Now, quite often for this case, you'll find sources saying that these socks were pink, but they were actually a mustardy brown colour with a sort of knit pattern. Perhaps the background colour here could be described as pink, but that feels like a stretch. To my eyes, they are definitely mustard brown. Investigators found these socks were bought at a local stall in Burton Market, suggesting that this man might have been local, or at least was local in the few months before his death. It's also thought that the socks had about 2 to 3 months wear with chafing on the heel and toe, which maybe suggested some poor fitting shoes. I also have no idea how they're able to tell this from socks, but he was also said to be quite light-footed. Seeing as he was a very slim man with a very small frame, that does kind of make sense with what we already know. The ligature around his ankles was tied around above his socks, and the ligature around his wrist was said to be tied very loosely. John Doe would have had a lot of freedom whilst tied up, and probably could have untied himself if he wished, and if he were alive at the time of the ligatures. In his report, the pathologist wrote that this was a man who followed a sedentary occupation. He wasn't really on his feet very much, and he took care of his personal appearance. He also said there are a number of different interpretations as to the nakedness and the ligatures, saying that the clothes were likely removed after death to prevent identification, and the death may have occurred during some sexual deviation practice, but the ligatures might have been applied after death as well. But he does write, it is unlikely that they would be tied in this manner to assist transport to the place of burial, but the purpose is otherwise obscure. Honestly, the whole pathologist's report does seem to be very contradictory here. He's like, the ligatures might have been there before death, but they might have been there after death. They probably weren't there to transport the body, but they weren't put on there until after the body had died or after the person had died. It really is not a very solid train of thought. He goes on to write about the use of ligatures during sex to cause some degree of asphyxia and therefore increase sexual pleasure, and he speculates that this could have been the cause of death. The post-mortem ruled out poison and shooting as causes of death. There was no evidence of either found on the body. There was also no evidence of any sort of overtly violent death either. There was no bone damage. Because of this lack of any physical damage, the pathologist believed that the death was caused by asphyxiation, maybe from a sexual act. He says that because of the amount of freedom of Fred's hands at the time he was found, and if his theory is correct, he doesn't think there was anything sinister in the motive at the time he was bound. Basically, this was a sex game gone wrong, and then somebody freaked out, left with this dead body. However, that's what the pathologist said. The police have never been quite as sold on this sex theory. As well as the socks and ligatures, the only other item found on John Doe's body was a 9-carat gold wedding ring found on his right ring finger, aka not the hand on which we wear wedding rings in the UK. And not only that, the wedding ring was found to be a female wedding ring. I wondered how investigators were able to tell this at first. I mean, a wedding ring is just a gold band for the most part, right? Male and female tend to look the same. But it actually seems they were able to trace this ring back to its manufacturer. This batch was made in 1967 to 68 and only 5,000 of them were made. Through this, they probably discovered that the ring was a woman's ring. I've seen a lot of speculation as to why on earth a man would be wearing a woman's ring, but this man, remember, had very small hands. So small that they were pointed out as a distinguishable feature about him. It's likely that a woman's ring just fitted him better. But in terms of why he was wearing the ring on his right hand instead of on his left, there have been a whole slew of theories. The first theory is that he might not have even been from the UK. Whilst here it is tradition for people to wear their wedding rings on their left ring fingers, in many countries it's the right. It seems like that's a thing in a lot of countries across Eastern Europe, as well as Spain, Norway, Denmark, India, many countries in South America. This man was said to be European white, so we can probably rule him out as being Indian or South American. Yes, I know some people in South America are white, but most tend to have a more genetically mixed heritage. They're pretty sure he was from Europe. Perhaps that could also explain why he's never been identified as well. If he was from abroad, a missing persons report, if there ever was one, might have never quite reached the UK. The question then becomes, why was this man in the UK and why did he die? Again, we don't know. We could assume if this is the case and he was from mainland Europe, that his wife and family weren't in the UK with him, because surely they would have reported him as missing and the connection would have been made. But there are other reasons for a man to wear his wedding ring on his right finger, and that's that it could have been a form of queer flagging. Now obviously for long periods through time it wasn't safe to be openly gay, and that stood for both queer men and queer women. So the queer community had to turn to something called queer flagging to send subtle signals to other gay people that they might be interested. And it had to be subtle things that straight people wouldn't necessarily pick up on. There are so many examples of queer flagging, from Oscar Wilde wearing a green carnation on the opening night of his play, leading to other gay men wearing green carnations as a calling card. There's the hanky code, where different coloured handkerchiefs were used to non-verbally communicate one's interests. I suppose if we're talking more recent history through sort of the 70s and 80s, sometimes having your right ear pierced would be a signal. Of course, all these things are great until the straight public pick up on it, and then instead of it being a subtle signal, instead it becomes an outing. And therefore, most ways of flagging do eventually die out and become replaced by something new. Nowadays, you could look at things like fashion trends as queer flagging, sapphic women having short, clean nails, wearing a lot of rings, certain brands of clothing being worn. Flagging is constantly happening. I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there. Queer history is like my bread and butter. But I say all of this to point out that in some circles, wearing a wedding ring on your wrong hand may have been seen as queer flagging, a subtle signal that you're gay. Now, this wouldn't have been a particularly well-known signal, but I was able to find mention of it in a few places online. A big problem with queer history sort of pre-80s, pre-AIDS pandemic is that we lost a whole generation of gay men, and through that we lost a huge chunk of our history. Wearing a wedding ring on your wrong hand may have been more commonplace as queer flagging back then, but we have no way of knowing it for sure because a lot of people died. But there was also something else it could have been, like instead of queer flagging, in a time before gay marriage was legal, some long-term gay couples who considered themselves married would wear their wedding rings on the wrong hand, a symbol to themselves of their love, but not necessarily outing themselves to the general public. If that were the case for our John Doe here, there might have been a second half of this marriage out there who was too scared to ever report his husband missing to the police, scared of any repercussions. This was 1971. At this point, whilst homosexuality had been decriminalised in the UK, that does not mean police weren't taking every excuse they could to arrest gay men. Actually, more gay men were arrested after decriminalisation, but that's a whole other video. But of course, all of these are just theories. We don't know anything for sure, and maybe too much time and energy is focused on this wedding ring. I did see some speculation that this could have been an heirloom, but investigators found when it was manufactured. It was recent, it was 67 to 68, it couldn't have been an heirloom. By the end of November 1971, investigators had managed to eliminate about 400 males as being our John Doe through fingerprints, dental records, and just general physical descriptions. Every police force in Britain was asked to submit details of missing males in John Doe's approximate age range, and investigators painstakingly went through each and every one. They also appealed for the general public to come forward with any tips at all, even if someone they just knew in passing had disappeared for a while, maybe a colleague stopped turning up for work. There was casual acquaintances that maybe you hadn't seen down the pub for a while, a friend of a friend that you'd heard through a grapevine had just disappeared. Investigators wanted to know. They were willing to look at any and all avenues that were available to them. They did have some of John Doe's fingerprints available to them to sort of make comparisons, but they were unable to get a complete set of prints from fingers and thumbs. So I guess what they had was partial fingerprints, which does add an extra layer of complication in that they couldn't rely on that alone to rule people out. But next I want to take some time to talk about the area in which John Doe was found. Now this is described as an island on the River Trent, but it actually wasn't quite an island. On one side you accessed it over a footbridge over the River Trent from Newton Road, on the other side it was just land pretty much. So if you wanted to access this private land from over the footbridge, you actually had to have a key to two large padlock gates on either side of the bridge. David Nathan did have a key. He was given access to this land in exchange for keeping an eye out and keeping intruders off of it, and then he would go there in the evening and shoot, keeping vermin away and just doing target practice. Investigators seem pretty certain that it wasn't accessed from over the bridge, so it makes sense that the land was accessed from the other side. But this wasn't necessarily a piece of land you'd know about unless you were a local. It seems that somebody knew that this piece of land was rarely explored by the general public, and therefore it was a safe place to bury a body, with a very low likelihood of it being discovered. I mean, if it weren't for Nathan and his shooting, maybe it wouldn't have been discovered for a very long time. But investigators here all seem to be in agreement that whoever buried John Doe in this location had to be a local, somebody from Burton, or maybe even Winshill itself. This area of land is referred to by locals as an island because it used to be surrounded by a canal, but the canal was drained at some point and filled with silt, and from what I can gather, it eventually just became part of the main land. So it's called an island because you access it still via the footbridge, but it's not really an island. If I'm being completely honest, finding the exact locations in question here was very complicated, but I did get there in the end. If you're watching this via my YouTube video, you can see on screen now the map. Whilst this dump site was easiest accessed from the footbridge leading from Newton Road, it could also be accessed from the other side via Meadow Road. A car would have been able to drive up to the site to a certain point through rough tracks and through fields, but eventually there was fencing that a car would not have been able to get past. Now this is assuming that the body was taken to the burial point via car, which seems much more likely than somebody carried a body there, so that assumption is probably correct. Once they'd driven the car as close to the fencing as possible, the perpetrator would have had to have lifted the body out of the vehicle, carried it over the fence, and then up to a small hill at the top, where the remains would be found a number of months later. Why make the effort of moving the body all the way up to the top of this small hill? Probably because it was more secluded, it was surrounded by trees, it was a bit more out of sight. It seems the general assumption here is that it was a single person responsible for John Doe's burial, but of course there's no way of knowing that for sure. It would have been a lot easier to move the body if there were 2 people involved here. Or of course there's a chance that this is where John Doe died, but again investigators don't think that's all that likely. Besides, there was no evidence to suggest this, no evidence of murder on this land. So chances are John Doe was transported via car to as close to the fencing as possible, and then somebody, maybe 2 people but probably just one, took his body out of the car, probably before rigor mortis set in, lifted him over the fence and then up the small hill, dug a small hole and buried him. In the early days of the investigation, there was speculation that John Doe could have been a man called Brian Anthony Edge, who'd been born in Dublin in 1941 and came to the UK aged 20 in 1961. He married his wife Patricia that same year, and they went on to have 3 children together, living in Watford, just outside of London, so it wasn't particularly close to Winshill. But one day in April 1970, Brian just disappeared after finishing his round that morning. He worked as a milkman. It was a baffling disappearance, but it was a mystery that only deepened when Brian allegedly wrote to his wife and told her to put an advertisement in the personal columns of the News of the World. He said there was something he needed to tell her and he would only do so once he saw her reply in this ad. And then no one ever heard from him again. Brian was said to be a quiet family man. He loved his children. He was a reliable milkman. There was no rhyme or reason as to his disappearance. Was Brian Edge? Fred the Head? Well, his wife said she didn't recognise the wedding ring the victim was wearing, nor did she know about any dental work her husband had had done. But then again, the work was recent, there's every chance he could have had it done after he left home. All in all, there was no evidence to suggest that Brian was John Doe, so that lead did eventually hit a dead end. After that, there was nothing for a very, very long time. It seemed unbelievable to police that a man could just disappear and no one would notice, no one would report him as missing. Even if this man didn't have a wife or children of his own, surely he had parents, a brother, a sister, cousins. But there was nothing. Eventually, police reached out to Interpol, the international police organisation, to try and get the word about John Doe out across the world. If he was European, this would expand the chances of him being identified. And the media did pick up on this. Newspapers globally did include him in their reports. Maybe not front page, but he did have small articles, which was something. But it definitely didn't reach every person. News of this wouldn't have even reached every person in the UK, but it was still something. And still, nothing. On Friday, June 21st, 1974, over 3 years after his discovery, John Doe was finally laid to rest in an unnamed grave in Burton Cemetery. No headstone, no marker, nothing. But investigators have said they'll keep at it until he does have a headstone, until he has a name. There are any number of theories and potential leads I could speculate on in this video, but I think I do want to keep speculation here to a minimum. I want to just share the facts, the things we know, and get the word out there as best I can without muddying it with theories and speculation. But I do just want to say police did actually very recently look into potential links to a serial killer called Anthony Hardy, who was the Camden Killer, because he was born and raised in Winshill. He would have been just 20 years old at the time John Doe was found, so John Doe could have been one of his first victims. Further links were then made through the fact that Hardy was known to have dressed his victims in Mr. Men, Mr. Happy socks, and John Doe was found in only a pair of socks. But the rest of his victims were female, and John Doe was obviously a male. Hardy was sentenced to a life sentence in 2010, and he died in November 2021. At some point there was speculation that investigators back in 1971 may have been mistaken and John Doe might have been female, but forensic testing has since proven that without a doubt he was biologically male. Investigators said they would look into the Hardy theory, but that was in October 2022 and there hasn't been an update yet. I'm not sure if there will be with his death and all. It seems there was increased media coverage in this case around 2021, which would have been the 50th anniversary of John Doe's discovery. There were countless online articles I found on Staffordshirelive.com in the early months of 2021. Detective Chief Inspector Dan Ison said at this point that the investigation is very much still ongoing, and since the body was found, DNA profiling has been carried out on the skeleton, and although there have been strong links with possible family members, these have all led to nothing. I wish I had more information in regards to that, but sadly I don't. Here in the UK, we don't use genealogical testing in the same way that they do in the USA to identify does. The government just haven't approved it yet, and it doesn't look like they're going to anytime soon. I'll link a video down below where I do outline their full reasoning for this because I don't want to have to go through all that again, but basically the government just aren't convinced about the ethics around genealogical testing. The ethics of using people's DNA in such a way. So John Doe can't be identified in that way. I will assume that the DNA profile here was compared to the DNA database we do have here in the UK, which features only 6.6 million profiles from criminals and crime scene DNA only, out of the 68 million people we have here in the UK. It said that the police travelled up and down the country following these DNA links, but they've all been eliminated, and that's about all we know. It's just not as sophisticated as what they're doing with DNA identifications across the pond. This sort of gives a likelihood of somebody being genetically related, but it's not 100%. There was also some increased interest in this case back in 2017 as well, when this case was featured on BBC's Crime Watch Roadshow, and a new facial reconstruction was revealed, created from new dental record techniques. That's when the black and white reconstruction that I've shown throughout this video was revealed. This is incredibly lifelike. This could be a photo of a person, but the man here does look a million miles from the man in the original sketch back in the 70s. I guess that's kind of to be expected as technology gets better. We can probably assume that the more recent sketch is the more lifelike one, but there's no way of knowing that for sure. But on the back of the Crime Watch Roadshow, a family of a missing Cardiff man called John Henry Jones came forward, claiming that he could be Fred or John Doe. People got really excited about this potential lead in this case. At this point, it was 47 years on from the discovery. Henry had been listed as missing from, and please excuse my pronunciation here, Llangollen in November 1970, and initial dental studies comparing Henry's dental records with John Doe's skull did suggest a potential match. But then they did familial DNA testing and sadly confirmed it was not a match. Detective Chief Inspector Dan Ison says they will continue to work the DNA angle using the National DNA Database and sites such as Ancestry as far as they're kind of legally able to, but I guess it's just a case of waiting until someone does flag up another match. According to a Staffordshire Live article from 2021, the DNA was last tested in sort of 2017, 2018, but redoing the test now isn't going to change the outcome. It's the DNA profile, it's just a waiting game now. Ison has also said that despite the socks coming from a local Burton market, he doesn't believe that Fred John Doe was local from this area because no one from the area has ever come forward. It seems from what he's saying that this was a very close-knit area and he thinks if John Doe was a local, somebody would have known him. The man who ran the murder inquiry at the time of the discovery, Detective Chief Inspector Peter Hoff, sadly died in 2020, and he said one of the greatest frustrations of his career was never identifying Fred the Head. But the investigation is not over. He could very much still be identified today. People who might have known John Doe, assuming they were around his age, will be in their late 70s, early 80s right now. If you have elderly family members who lived in or around Burton at this time, maybe share this story with them, see if they know anything. Obviously, people who knew John Doe will now be in their sort of twilight years, so it's vital we get information as soon as possible. Before I sign off, I do just want to shout out a couple of very interesting sources I use for this video. There's a Facebook page called Who Was Fred the Head, which is a great page to have a scroll through with lots of potential theories. Particularly if you live in the area, I think you'll find this really interesting. A lot of these people on this page seem to spend a good chunk of their time researching this, and they look at every single angle possible. Like I said, I'm here to get the facts out of my video. You can find the rampant speculation elsewhere, like on this Facebook page. There's also a podcast which seems to be linked to the Facebook group. It's called The Mysterious Case of Fred the Head. Again, there are so many episodes of this podcast. I think there are 38 so far and they're still being released. So if you want a really, really deep dive, you can go and give that a listen. And then there's a book called Fred the Head and Other Unsolved Mysteries by Michael Posner, which I relied on quite heavily for the pathologist report and similar. So again, I would recommend that. Fred John Doe has a name. His name is out there somewhere in the memory of someone who once knew him. We just have to reach that person. And then once we know his name, there's every chance we'll also be able to find his killer as well. Was he killed as part of a sex game gone wrong, the killer panicking and disposing of his body, just getting lucky that technology wasn't advanced enough to point the finger? Was it somebody with a personal vendetta against this man? Could he have been involved in some shady things? Was it a hate crime? Until we have his name, we probably won't know the answer to any of those questions. Thank you so much for tuning in today and taking a moment to learn about Fred, John Doe, and I guess I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.